Thank you for joining us. I am Belle from Living Well, and I am so happy to introduce my friend, Dr. Lauren Craig. She is back. So if you are aware, she did a Thriving with ADHD presentation, a few Novembers ago, I think.
Mhm.
Time flies, that's insane. But that is
Yes.
recorded and on our YouTube channel, if you are interested in that. But she is back by popular demand, and without further ado, go ahead, Lauren. Oh, I will monitor the chat, but I'm sure Lauren will mention that we'll just go through the slides and get all that information out, and we'll take some questions at the end. But I will be monitoring the chat if anyone has anything else to say.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Belle. And I'm so glad to have the chance to be with you all this morning. I was telling Belle this morning, I'm going to apologize in advance. This voice has been hanging out, has taken an extended vacation, been sick for about going on a month now, as everybody knows it's going around, but very grateful to be feeling a lot better than I actually sound. But I've begged, pleaded, bribed my voice to come back, but it is still in an extended vacation. So, um, we have lots of hydration, lots of cough drops. We're going to get through it together, but I do apologize in advance if it gets a little bit froggy. But yeah, I'm super excited to have a chance to talk with y'all today. As Belle mentioned, she's phenomenal about monitoring the chat. I know myself well enough to know that I work probably best of staying on track and making sure we get through everything if we kind of run through it all, but I will be really intentional about trying to leave about 10, 15 minutes at the end to go through those questions. But feel free, like I said, pop those in the chat as you go, because I know sometimes it's like, I don't want to hold my question in the end because I may forget it. So feel free to put it there and we can always circle back to it. But yeah, it was a great opportunity to be able to talk about kind of thriving of like what ADHD is in the first presentation, but really I think being able to build on that and talk about how this shows up in the workspace and how we can not only kind of cope and thrive with our ADHD brains if we are individuals who have ADHD, but also how can we support our colleagues and coworkers, right? And so that's really my hope for how we can use this time together today is get an understanding. Again, all of us are probably pretty familiar with what ADHD is, but really talk about the impact it has for us in the workplace, and then identify some strategies in these different areas. So, and then as always, I always love to give as many resources, tools, support, places to continue to build on our education. So I hope to leave y'all with some really helpful tools in that as well. So just jumping right in. So I always tell the story when I was in grad school, one of my ended up being one of my favorite professors, was also one of my most intimidating professors that I ever had. Um, would always start every question and answer session after we would do a presentation with this question of who cares? And at the time, it was really terrifying to get that question, but I learned a lot from that. And now I'm really intentional about kind of starting my presentation with why is this important, right? Why are you all taking time out of your day to day to make time to kind of learn about this and talk about this? And so I think it's always a good way to lay the foundation of why is this an important use of our time? Um, so as we know, right, there's a what we found is that there's about 3 to 5% of adult workers worldwide that have diagnosed ADHD, right? So when we think about it, that's millions of adults. And quite honestly, we probably know that there's likely millions more, but because ADHD can frequently go undiagnosed, underdiagnosed. And so the reality is, as all of us know, that we're likely to work with at least one colleague who has ADHD if we are not the person ourselves that have it and have been diagnosed with it. And so it is considered a super common condition. And we also know that it does have a significant impact in the workplace. Some studies have shown that those individuals with ADHD are about 20% less likely to be employed compared to adults without ADHD, and can earn up to about 15% less in lifetime earnings compared to adults without ADHD. And so these are important numbers, it's important data, and it has a huge impact, right? We also know that it's really common to kind of talk about some of the job stability concerns that can show up. So there's been some studies that show that up to 61% of adult workers with ADHD have reported being fired from their job. 33% have reported being laid off at some point from one of their jobs. And just a little over half of adult workers with ADHD have reported quitting a job or multiple jobs throughout the course of their career. And so I think keeping these things in mind of not only the prevalence, how common it is for us to show up in the workspace, but also the impacts it's having on our finances, our well-being, but also being able to recruit and retain and create environments that feel fulfilling for all individuals is an important thing to consider. And so that's really my hope that we can kind of keep in mind as we get to talk through some of these things today. And so kind of transitioning into like what is, right, ADHD, we are going to dive into some of the more specific things that we all kind of know and are aware of. But I actually think that, to me, it's important. I think there's still a lot of misconceptions about ADHD and the impact that it can have on someone's professional life. And I think that some of those misconceptions or myths about ADHD can lead to feelings of friction or frustration and maybe even missed opportunities, not only for a person who may have ADHD, but also their colleagues and the people we work with every day. And so I thought it would be helpful for us to kind of start with what it is versus what it isn't, right? And just being able to kind of remind ourselves that a lot of times one prevalent myth is that ADHD is about a lack of willpower or laziness, right? And in reality, many individuals with ADHD often have to work harder than their, coworkers and colleagues who may not have ADHD to achieve those same results, right? And that often ends up kind of resulting in an individual who has ADHD is spending a significant amount of mental and emotional energy trying to manage their symptoms and still meet the expectations as their coworkers, right? And the expectations that they have for themselves. And so I always like to start with what it's not, right? It's not an indicator of lesser or diminished skills or interests in your work area, or even ability or intelligence. It's not an indicator of laziness or a lack of discipline. And it's not this idea of like, it's intentional or a poor reflection of somebody's abilities or a lack of work ethic. And really, as we're going to kind of talk a little bit about, this is always a little bit of a hot take when I talk about it, because in the name, right, we say it's an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right? Like that's the name for ADHD. But really, I think I always like to highlight it's not necessarily about being an attention deficit. Really, I think it's actually more helpful to think of ADHD as it's a difficulty with being able to regulate that attention. And what I mean by that is what we'll find as we kind of talk through here today is there are times where an individual with ADHD can actually focus quite well. And so it's not that, oh, I can't focus all the time. It's more about, hey, can I regulate when I need to have that focus and where that needs to be directed in a way that's going to be helpful for me and most productive for me. And so kind of keeping that in mind at the baseline, I think is a really helpful start. But also reminding ourselves that ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. It's often diagnosed in childhood, but we are seeing more and more as just awareness increases, more research comes out. There's more and more adults who are actually becoming diagnosed as adults and maybe starting to see and address these things for the first time. Maybe they've been able to kind of adapt and adjust throughout childhood. But when we get to adulthood, really start to notice some of these struggles and feel like the tools I had in place aren't enough for the expectations that I've had for myself. And so then we're starting to see that in adulthood more and more. So that's really important to kind of keep in mind and why it's showing up in the workspace so much. And then lastly, what I really want to encourage us to do is recognizing like ADHD is part of, I call it like that broader spectrum, that broader umbrella of neurodiversity, right? And neurodiversity just being a term where we're essentially kind of recognizing that these neurological differences are just part of a natural variation in human cognition, right? The way that we take in information, we process information, we use that to solve problems, the way we interact in the world. And so one isn't better or worse than another. It's just a difference, a natural difference in variation. And so even though most, and I would say a majority of our tools and strategies and things that we're going to talk about today are focused under this ADHD piece, I'd really like to encourage us to kind of think about, I think a lot of these could also be applied to just neurodiversity as a whole, and just being aware of the different ways this can show up and be helpful for us in general in our workspace. So that being said, we'll spend a couple minutes, right? We're not going to spend too long, but these are like the main takeaways. So when we actually think of ADHD, reminding ourselves that ADHD at its heart actually kind of shows up in three different presentations. So we have ADHD primarily inattentive. And so that's where if somebody has that diagnosis or that's showing up in that way for them, that's where you're going to see, the trouble sustaining attention for long periods of time, maybe feeling like they're not listening when being spoken to, have a tendency to maybe start a bunch of tasks, but have trouble maybe finishing them, or kind of hop around from task to task. So it may take longer to finish any one thing, maybe struggle with organizing, maybe time, schedules, but also like living spaces, maybe lose items easily or feel easily distracted or forgetful. The more hyperactive, impulsive presentation, that's what we're going to think of again, probably that the HD part of it, right? Where we're kind of more fidgety, restless, maybe feeling like, I call it like the Energizer Bunny mentality, maybe super talkative, but also may have trouble like waiting at their turn, or may like interrupt or intrude on others in meetings or in conversations with colleagues. And obviously that's going to show up and maybe look differently as adults than, when we're kids and young teenagers too. And then combined presentation, I would say, is probably the most common, but that's where we're going to experience equal amounts of symptoms kind of from both presentations. And so just really being aware, again, I kind of make a note of what the diagnostic criteria, the kind of the amount of symptoms that have to be present. Not as important for our conversation today, but just kind of being aware that, again, we can get diagnosed in childhood, but also in adulthood for the first time as well. But in reality, this is actually my favorite way of kind of looking and thinking about the different symptoms of ADHD. I really appreciate this image. I think it's a really good analogy that helps represent what having a diagnosis of ADHD can look and feel like. And so really just acknowledging that top layer, right? Those external symptoms that we see are just the tip of it, right? But the internal experience for somebody who has ADHD or experiences these symptoms is so much more, right? It's not just about trouble paying attention or feeling restless. It's also trouble with managing or expressing strong emotions sometimes, or feeling like my mood can rapidly switch, what feels like out of nowhere, right? Maybe trouble making decisions, or struggling with planning ahead, or again, organizing my time and schedule. So I really just appreciate just acknowledging that even when we're, again, whether we experience this ourselves or we're working with people and trying to support friends, family, coworkers, recognizing that we probably only see and can experience or hear just a certain amount, but there's always probably a lot underneath that they're also trying to manage, often alone, right? And so just kind of being mindful of that, I think, is a helpful start. And so how does this actually show up in the workplace, right? What are we seeing, again, for ourselves or with the people that we're working with? Kind of taking all those things that we talked about before, this may show up as trouble focusing, or again, regulating how we direct our attention. So being able to kind of stay locked in for long meetings, but also I think about it in terms of how do we manage and kind of navigate big projects, right? And how we are prioritizing our time and where our attention and energy and resources need to be, right? Maybe frequently missing deadlines or having to be reminded about deadlines frequently, managing time, as we mentioned, also impulsive decision making. So just kind of like that putting out fires vibe sometimes, and maybe not having the space or time to kind of think through, hey, how is this one decision? What are some of the consequences it may lead to? And just being able to kind of be the most efficient or productive. And then I think, again, like we mentioned, a lot of times there's a lot of mental and emotional energy that's going into managing these symptoms, and that can create a lot of stress, which can feel just really exhausting. Again, if you're constantly feeling like you're putting out fires or you're trying to make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks, like that takes a toll over time. And so struggling with just managing that stress and all of the emotions that can come with that, it's really, really common to feel those feelings of burnout, right? And so just being mindful of all those different things and the ways that that can show up. Um, One thing I want to kind of pause here that I always just like to really acknowledge is I think what I've learned and just getting to continue to learn about ADHD, but also having conversations with people who have been diagnosed or who do kind of manage these symptoms in their day-to-day life is just kind of acknowledging that those who have ADHD, or again, that broader umbrella of a neurodivergent brain, they are very aware. They know what they struggle with. And I always think it's worth mentioning that, in fact, a lot of times what I found is it's often all that they see about themselves. And I think that because of that, what I found is I think it's really important to try to be intentional about highlighting the strengths and that they do bring to the table, that they do bring to the workspace, and being able to provide positive feedback in the ways that some of their experiences are actually like a harness strength for the company and the work that we're doing, right? I think that a lot of times, because there's so much time and energy being spent on trying to make sure nothing falls through the cracks and trying to get it right, um, there may not be a lot of energy for looking at the ways, the things that they do bring to the table and that the ways that they are successful. And so I think there is a fundamental difference between feeling like you're good at your job, right? Versus kind of feeling like I just can't get it right, or there's always something kind of falling through. And so I think that that really sets a tone in our workplace of, hey, are we actively looking for ways to encourage that? And so that being said, right, what are some of the strengths? How does that show up in the workplace? Um, Coming back to what we mentioned again, it's not necessarily always about matter of I have a deficit in attention. One of the strengths is being able to actually hyper focus at times, right? And being able to lock in once I find something that is of interest or I'm able to kind of really hone in on, I can get a lot of really productive work done in a short amount of time in those moments where I'm hyper focused, right? Um, Also being able to be adaptable, right? We sometimes call it the flip side of that coin is like, oh, like I'm constantly feeling like I'm putting out fires, right? Like I may have impulsive decision making. And on the flip side of that coin, I can be really adaptable, right? I may be a little bit more calm in a crisis because I can think on my feet a bit more. I can have that creativity, that outside the box thinking, and bring a level of like that high energy, resilience, right? Being able to bring that to the workspace as well. And so again, kind of remembering that every challenge that we talked about, there's probably a flip side to that coin of ways that it can be really helpful too, when we harness it in ways that are helpful and productive for us. Okay, I think we're doing okay on time so far. So now we're going to kind of transition into talking a little bit about what are some strategies for coping with ADHD in the workplace. And so I'm going to spend the first kind of chunk of time talking about strategies and things that can be used individually, right? Tips that I can use just in my one-on-one workspace, to kind of help my own workflow work a little better. But that being said, you're going to start to see a lot of overlap in how these show up in kind of creating, like working with teams and supporting coworkers. And I think that there's a lot of these that can be helpful for everybody. So we are going to start with the individual, and then we'll kind of transition into what does this look like in the team space. And so really, as we kind of start thinking about what some of these strategies are, I think it's helpful to say, okay, hey, to get the best out of my ADHD brain or my neurodivergent brain, it's really about making sure that I'm getting the accommodations that my brain needs to try to minimize some of the obstacles or hurdles or challenges that can often come with ADHD. And so what might that look like? I think there's a few different things that we can kind of keep in mind, right? So the first is how can I create a structured environment, right? We know structure is essential. And so using things to kind of create an organized workspace, which we'll get to in a second, but using the planners, the digital calendars to track deadlines and appointments, utilizing to-do lists, right? But I think also prioritizing tasks in a daily way versus say like a weekly goal sheet or a monthly goal sheet, right? So am I establishing a consistent routine that I can say, what do I want to get accomplished today versus what do I have to get done all next week? And I think a balance is always good, but also making sure that we're kind of being where our feet are as much as we can. And what do I need to kind of get done that's right in front of me? Establishing a consistent routine for starting and ending our workday, right? Creating checklists so we can kind of make it as autopilot or automatic as we can, to kind of free up some of that mental headspace as well. Secondly, optimizing your workspace, right? So the physical environment also plays a crucial role. It's like asking ourselves, how can I minimize distractions? So can I use noise canceling headphones? Or how can I, work in a quiet area? Can I keep my desk as clutter-free and organized as possible? Are there color coding systems that I can use for my files or documents, right? Like red, yellow, green, like dire tasks, these can wait. These are maybe future tasks. Um, Considering things like standing desks, fidget toys. I'm a big fan of like the fidget tools to kind of manage that restless energy while you're sitting, or kind of, again, balancing sitting and standing at your desk. How can we utilize technology in a way that's helpful? There's a ton of different apps. I'll include some of them on here, but I know I'll probably miss some for sure. But there's a lot of apps that can help, right? Things like time tracking apps. I've heard of like Rescue Time, Toggle, to help us monitor productivity. There's tools to kind of help us manage projects, right? So helping us organize our tasks, things like Trello, Asana. And again, I can create a list for anybody who's interested in some of these. Using reminder apps for important deadlines, meetings. And then I'm sure all of us have heard of kind of the focus apps, right? There's like Forest, Freedom, a ton of other ones to kind of help block distracting websites or apps that may pull us away into the rabbit hole from time to time. Time management techniques, right? Just continuing to look for ways to manage our time a little better. One of the most common ones that people recommend is using what we call the Pomodoro technique, right? So working in those 25-minute blocks of time with like a 5-minute break in between, and kind of breaking up our day into just smaller chunks of time. But also scheduling, I think, like practicing time blocking. So scheduling specific time slots for different tasks. And so one of the things that I always kind of recommend or encourage is, if you're using the Pomodoro technique and you're breaking down your time into these 25-minute blocks, also when we come back, are we also kind of adjusting or being flexible with how we are scheduling tasks in terms of like high, medium, or low levels of energy? And so do I know myself and I'm saying, hey, like I'm going to be most productive maybe mid-morning. Well, I may schedule in those first kind of 25-minute blocks, for those first couple, I may do some more low energy tasks, right? Checking the emails, clearing the inbox a little bit, and then maybe schedule some of my more higher mental energy things for that mid-morning when I know I've had a chance to wake up, my brain to lock in a little bit. Some people may need to switch that up. And so just kind of thinking about not only breaking things down, but can I adjust it in a way where I'm kind of balancing some of those higher and lower mental energy tasks. Setting realistic deadlines, right? And building in buffer time for unexpected delays. I think that's the biggest thing. We know, we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we know time blindness is a real thing, right? Recognizing that we feel like we can get a task done in a shorter amount of time than it actually takes. And so being able to continue to tweak and get better of setting realistic deadlines, and building in time for life to be lifey sometimes. And then using timers to kind of help us stay on track for some of those tasks. Developing effective communication, right? So asking for clarification, right, on tasks and expectations of us, taking notes during meetings and conversations. Maybe part of that conversation is at the end of a meeting, repeating the important information back to make sure, hey, we're on the same page. This is what I heard. Is that what you're actually needing from me? And then really using that written communication or email, things like that for the complex instructions, right? The things that we can, okay, I have the first two tasks, but I'm going to be able to come back and refer back to these for steps 3 through 7, right? And being able to kind of work together in that too. Practicing self-care and stress management, right? Like, I think it's always important to note that managing ADHD, it does require a holistic approach, right? You're like we've mentioned, or I've mentioned a lot of, like, it does take a lot of mental and emotional energy. So being able to make sure that when I'm not at work, am I also prioritizing my sleep schedule? Am I doing my best to stay as consistent in my sleep schedule as I possibly can? Am I also exercising regularly to kind of help improve my focus, to try to channel that energy and that restlessness and that stress in some outward ways? Am I taking time to kind of keep that balanced diet, staying hydrated? I made a joke with Belle earlier that the positive thing about being sick is that I've never been more hydrated in my life. So that's one thing I can check off lately, which has been helpful. So, and then seeking accommodations when we need them, right? So we'll talk about that toward the end of our time today, but remembering that, you know, ADHD is one of the conditions that falls under the ADA, right? And so being familiar with what are some accommodations that would be helpful for you and that you do qualify for, right? Things like, again, the noise reducing headphones, or asking for extended deadlines, asking for some of those written instructions, just again, becoming familiar and being able to advocate for yourself and work with your supervisor for what you're needing. But we're going to dive a lot more in detail in that a little later. And then I always end with, regardless of like any of these like tips and strategies, working with your brain, right? And knowing that some of the things that may be helpful for me may not be helpful for you. And that's okay. But really just kind of getting to try out a few things and go with what works, and trust that what works for you, like being able to kind of support that, giving yourself permission to work within ways that are actually helpful for you. I want to spend a few minutes talking about some tools and apps that there's a really great video. So I included the link here at the bottom. She's a great professional. She is somebody who is diagnosed with ADHD, and she has some really great video series on just things that have worked for her. And she had this great like kind of productivity apps that she found to be really helpful, and kind of broke them down into 4 different areas. So the first was what she called mind mapping, right? And so this is kind of being able to kind of help visualize or visually organize your thoughts, kind of brainstorm ideas, break projects into more manageable steps. We know kind of a visual approach can be helpful. And so she mentioned a free app called Ioya that she mentioned you can kind of keep adding to it. It auto organizes for you. There is a paid version where you can kind of collaborate with coworkers or teammates, but spoke really highly of that app. Also talked about more of like what we call the second brain apps, right? So being able to kind of capture what's ever into your head, help you organize it in a way that's going to support what you're trying to get done and trying to accomplish. And so that one app that was mentioned was called X Tiles. Talked about helping you kind of centralize your notes, reduce kind of that mental clutter. Also talked about it provides customizable templates. So I guess on that app, there's one called an ADHD basic planner that's already kind of built in, where you can just kind of plug and play and kind of maybe plan out your week or different things that you have going on. And then it also integrates with your calendar. So Google Calendar, it can kind of sync up with that. So kind of help you keep track of deadlines and things like that. Weekly planning, right? One app that was mentioned was called Sensama. This one is a paid subscription, but did offer a free trial. But what was helpful about this one that I appreciated was they talked about it helping build what we call sustainable productivity, right? So kind of helping us ask the questions of what do I want to get done today? But also probably the more important question of what can wait, right? And so this app really helping with that time blindness problem of feeling like I can create a to-do list with 20 items, but realistically I can probably only get to 3, but then I feel really guilty that I didn't get to the other 17, right? Being able to use this app to help us actually maybe prevent some of that burnout and give ourselves a little bit of grace of having a more balanced routine in how we're using our time. And then lastly, the distraction blockers. I mentioned a couple a while ago, but this was another one that was mentioned. Just helping us enhance our focus by limiting access to those distracting websites or apps. One thing that was mentioned for this app that I really appreciated was that it can help build what we call a distractibility delay. So distractibility delay is basically strengthening our ability to say, hey, can I wait a little bit before I allow a distraction to take over, right? I may ultimately end up still going to that app and still spending some time, but can I delay myself for 10 minutes, right? And if I still want to get on the app, then I'll let myself get on the app. But that over time, I can build that to 10, 20, 30 in a way that feels more sustainable than kind of beating myself up every time I get distracted or sidetracked. Okay. And then there's a whole host of other ones. I don't want to overload us with that, but again, if it would be helpful, I'll provide my contact at the end. I'm happy to create a running list of all of these that I found that people have said have been helpful. One thing that I always like to note when I go over this is also reminding ourselves that we want to avoid overboarding, right? So we tend to, and again, I think just acknowledging that we may be prone to overwhelm, or like I'm going to download all these apps and utilize all these apps, and now I'm spending all of my time on the apps and not what I need to be doing. And so encouraging us to maybe pick 1 or 2 at a time to try, and kind of tweaking as needed. All right. So now we're going to shift over to kind of talking about how can we support colleagues and kind of create an overall ADHD friendly workplace. All right. Starting off with talking about like, what are the benefits, right? Why, again, who cares? Why do we want to do this? I think first of all, right, and I think it's all, we can all agree that it's important, is that when we do implement ADHD friendly practices, right, at the heart of it, we are ensuring compliance with inclusion laws, right? The ADA, we're staying in line with things like that. So being proactive can kind of help avoid legal issues. I know everybody in this room, that is not the only reason, that's not the end all be all. We actually do want to promote a lot of these other things, such as realizing we can have that increased creativity and innovation, right? Like we've acknowledged, right? People with ADHD can have unique perspectives, the ability to think outside the box, right? Make unexpected connections. And so being able to kind of have an environment where all minds, and again, way of processing and using information are embraced and celebrated can only be a good thing. Also improve problem solving, right? So maybe sometimes that nonlinear thinking can be a powerful asset in tackling some of these problems. And so recognizing like having different voices and different approaches coming to the table to solve something, we can maybe solve our problems in a more comprehensive way, maybe even have some innovative solutions. And I think the other two are creating, again, that environment that feels welcoming, right? So we're going to have that better engagement, more retention, right? Less turnover. When somebody feels supported and valued for what they bring to the table, they're more likely to be engaged and committed to their work, right? So it can only improve job satisfaction and being able to keep good, talented people in our spaces. And then lastly, again, a positive impact on our overall reputation, right? Like if we're known for having inclusive practices and supportive environments, then that's only going to improve people wanting to come and work for us and increase the loyalty to our company, to our offices, to our spaces. So all good things to definitely keep in mind for sure. And so what are some ways to actually do this, right? So I think first kind of talking about, again, what are some things we can do to kind of create that inclusive, supportive, fulfilling environment? And then also keeping in mind, how are we monitoring ways to address either bias or negative interactions or discrimination that can take place? And so from creating the work environment perspective, asking ourselves like, and again, so I'm going to preface all of this with, a lot of these are ideas of in these ideal worlds, right? Do I think that there are probably ways that all of these could be implemented to some capacity? Absolutely. But also recognizing that we have to have some flexibility of what some of these things may look like. And so just kind of some things to keep in mind as you're brainstorming how how can we get better in this area and what might this look like in our space? Also recognizing we're always going to have ways to kind of tweak and improve over time. So starting with like flexible work arrangements, right? Asking ourselves, can there be some flexibility in work hours or location, right? Are there things for remote work options, flexible start and end times, asking ourselves and kind of working together, are there possibilities in that area? We mentioned minimizing distractions when we were talking about individual work, but again, can we create quiet spaces or designated kind of focus areas in our spaces where employees can work without feeling interrupted? Can we have a supply of some of those noise canceling headphones or privacy screens, even like small partitions in between cubicles to kind of help reduce some of that visual or audio distractions? Again, just kind of some ideas to keep in mind. Can we provide organization tools and resources, right? So the project management software, the digital calendars, the time tracking apps, or even physical things like whiteboards, sticky notes, color-coded folders. Um, any of those things can be helpful as well. And then encouraging regular breaks or movement, right? Are we building in time throughout the day and creating spaces where we can get up, move around, engage with each other or in some own individual activity to kind of help manage that restlessness and channel that energy in a helpful way. From addressing discrimination standpoint, right? Kind of understanding the legal protections, right? Being familiar with the legal protections that are afforded to employees with ADHD, and making sure that our company policies comply with those, right? Working really closely with our HR department to make sure that we are checking all those boxes. Um, recognizing and preventing, so being proactive, being vigilant about identifying and addressing any behaviors that may come up, right? So it may be overt actions and comments that are made, but also more subtle forms, right? Like, are we including other voices at the table? Are we, again, being proactive about just continuing to be educated, right? So promoting awareness and education, are we providing training or seeking out those educational resources on our own to just learn more about ADHD and again, that broad umbrella of neurodiversity. The more education we have, the more conversations we have, it just continues to reduce stigma and just, again, fosters a better environment in general. And so asking ourselves, hey, how can I continue learning and growing in this area? Which again, kind of underlies that creating that inclusive culture, right? That values, again, and supports all employees regardless of that umbrella of neurodiversity. So I think that's a healthy start. And then I think when it comes to the actual like work tasks, some things to keep in mind, some strategies to kind of help with the task management and productivity, right? Again, a lot of these we've talked about as individuals, but then also thinking about ways, how can we work together and brainstorm as a staff or with a fellow coworker to kind of improve in these areas too, right? So can we have conversations, help individuals divide our large projects into smaller, more manageable tasks, and set, again, check-ins and feedback where we can kind of stay on top of things. Again, we'll get to that in a second. But just having conversations of how do we break something down into smaller tasks? Can we set realistic deadlines and priorities, right? And kind of helping each other categorize like what is the urgency of these different tasks, what can wait, and being on the same page about agreeing on, hey, I may think this is really important, you may think this can wait. Where's the common ground between what do we actually want to do at the end of the day with that? And then again, the time management strategies that we talked about with the individual method, that can be helpful here as well, working together with that. Providing structure and routine, right? Again, having those clear routines and structures for the workday. But that might include things like having regular team meetings as a group. Do we have designated times throughout our day that all of us kind of check our email, right? Or we have, kind of project workflows where we know every Friday we send an update of where everybody is on their project, right? Something like that. I think that ties into communication, right? So when we are keeping up that communication and working and navigating through projects, are we clear and concise in our instructions, right? So kind of trying to avoid the vague terms, focusing on the what, the when, the how, the when, highlighting all those bullet points, providing instructions in both verbal and written formats, being specific about deadlines and expectations, scheduling those frequent brief check-ins to say, hey, how are things going? Are there any challenges that are cropping up that, what's working, what's not, and being able to kind of tweak along the way versus having to fix a lot of stuff at the back end. Using visual aids, like I said, like charts, diagrams, to convey information, following up those verbal conversations with a written summary, or again, just something we can reference back at a later time. And then I think there's always that undercurrent of always encouraging ourselves to practice that active listening, right? What I heard you say is this, is that accurate? Helps us stay on the same page. And then again, having empathy, and I think grace, not only for individuals with ADHD, but also those who don't experience ADHD, is we're going to step in it. We're going to work in different ways. We all have different preferences, but kind of giving ourselves grace of kind of working through some of these hurdles together. All right. And then the last few minutes here that I want to spend with you all before I kind of open it up for questions is talking about ways to both request and then also utilize accommodations, both as an individual, but also as your workspaces, your workplace, and companies. Now, I will preface this by saying, ultimately, I encourage everyone, individuals and groups, to work as closely as possible with your HR department and your supervisors. However, I think that these are some helpful things to keep in mind to kind of get that process started. Okay. And so I think kind of before starting anything, we always go with the groundwork of researching, hey, what are my company's policies on these accommodations? Gathering any documentation that I have for my diagnosis from my healthcare or medical professionals, looking at my job description and identifying the specific tasks that I may find challenging due to some of the symptoms of ADHD that I experience, and then trying to ahead of time prepare a list of potential accommodations or workarounds that could be helpful in helping me address these challenges. And so I think once that foundation is laid, then as an individual, being able to kind of say, hey, I've able to develop this clear, concise request, right? Kind of a brief explanation of ADHD, how it shows up for me, how it impacts my work. These are the accommodations that I'm requesting that I think will be helpful. Being able to kind of explain how it will help me perform, and then being open and prepared to kind of brainstorm and talk about maybe alternatives if those initial requests aren't immediately feasible. All right. And then having those conversations with, again, your HR rep, your supervisor, scheduling a private meeting, talking about that request, being open to questions. And really, I think at the heart of it, I think what's great for both the individual and the employee itself is this is really showing and communicating your commitment to your job, right? And that you're wanting to take whatever steps are necessary to be able to do your job well, right? And to be able to produce for the company. And so I think coming at it from that, it's like, how can we not want to work together, right? And then I always think it's helpful documenting, right? Again, following up those verbal requests with the written summary, just to have it to look back to, keeping copies of all that correspondence, and then documenting any agreements that are made, including the timelines for when these might be implemented, or whether we might revisit this to adjust and adapt if we need to. And that leads to following up and adjusting as we need, right? So scheduling those regular check-ins to kind of say, hey, what's working, what's not, and being proactive in maybe suggesting adjustments if some aren't working out as we originally expected or hoped, along the way. And again, I think that we've probably heard the word proactive like 17 million times already today, but I think that is really at the heart of being able to stay on top of it and being successful in building those relationships that are going to be helpful for everybody. As a company, right, again, we talked about understanding what our responsibilities are, familiarizing ourselves with that, working really closely with our HR department, understanding what reasonable accommodation means, right? And asking ourselves, hey, kind of just a system check. Do we have clear policies and procedures in place for handling this? And then I think, again, assessing what reasonable accommodations are available, implementing and monitoring them as we can, like we mentioned, and then also training our supervisor and coworkers on the importance of what these accommodations do and how they help. Again, I think that keeps that line of communication open for everybody in a helpful way. And like we always keep coming back to, this is ultimately the goal is it's creating a workplace culture that is inclusive and helpful and supportive for everyone. And everyone can actually benefit from the different ways that this is showing up. All right. And so these are just a snapshot, again, not an exhaustive list at all, but some common workplace accommodations that show up, right? Is things like environmental modifications. We've talked about the quiet workspaces, the noise canceling headphones, allowing the use of standing desks or fidget things, adjusting lighting to reduce kind of sensory overload sometimes, offering a private office if that's available, or that partitioned workspace. Time management and scheduling. Again, the flexible work hours, breaking large projects into smaller things, use of timers, regular check-ins, all the things we've talked about. Technology-based solutions, like we've mentioned, some of the maybe that text-to-speech software for helping read through long documents, or the flip side, speech-to-text software for note-taking or writing, the time tracking apps, the calendar apps, the reminders, the alerts, and then communication adaptations, right? So offering multiple channels for communicating, whether that's email, instant messaging through Teams, face-to-face communication, the written summaries we've talked about, maybe allowing recording of meetings, again, depending on confidentiality and pieces that we need to consider, but maybe allowing recordings if that's feasible so that they can review that or have reminders at a later date. And then encouraging the use of those clarifying questions, right? Or again, the paraphrasing to ensure we're on the same page. Like I mentioned before, I heard you say this, is that accurate? This is what this means for me. This is how I see this playing out. All of those types of conversations can be really helpful in just making sure everybody's communicating in a way where we're on the same page. Okay, and then as promised, I'm going to give 1 minute to just give a brief reference for how we can continue to educate ourselves, some great resources. These four here, again, not an exhaustive list at all, but these were resources that I found to be the most helpful in gathering and adding information for this presentation. And I think as both individuals and as a company, the Job Accommodation Network website is fantastic. It's an excellent resource for both employees and employers. It provides, I can't even explain to you like the amount of information that's available. And they have it specific to different conditions. So you can go in there and do a search for ADHD and it'll pop up with a comprehensive list of potential accommodations. They have actual like case studies or like real world examples of how this has been implemented in the workspace. They give guidance on how to go about requesting accommodations. They also give information on legal rights, responsibilities. It's a fantastic free resource. The Attention Deficit Disorder Association, another great website, provides resources and support for adults with ADHD, including workplace strategies. Same thing for National Resource Center on ADHD. All of these have phenomenal resources. And then the NeuroLaunch website, that website was very helpful. They actually have comprehensive guides for all of the different areas that we talked about. So a comprehensive guide on being an employee with ADHD in the workspace, supporting a coworker with ADHD in the workspace, a comprehensive guide for actual employers, and and creating, again, these ADHD friendly spaces, embracing neurodiversity. There's a whole host of very clear, very easily followable outlines with steps and checklists. I cannot say enough good things about that website. So I encourage you all to utilize these to continue building, to follow up on anything we talked about today. And again, I'm happy to provide this along with any of the tools and apps and things that I brought up in our talk so far today. I'm going to include here, as I open it up for questions, my email address. So as we move forward, if any of y'all would like to follow up or ask questions, or we can just chat further, I'm going to leave that up while we open it up for questions here.